I have not beaten the copyright allegations yet, so until I do, that theme song that I normally play at the top will not be played while the investigation into the scam company that keeps filing copyright claims on that theme is complete. I have my people out there working the case for me, as I mentioned last episode. But in that spirit, we welcome you to another episode of the Mike the David podcast. It's episode 138. We're coming off of a really interesting episode yesterday, and that was with retired NYPD detective first grade Mordecai Shanansky. He originally was in Midtown North throughout the 90s, but then in 2002, as Ray Kelly returned as police commissioner and put in the Counterterrorism Bureau, Mordecai, or as you guys know, Morty, went out to Israel as a foreign liaison and served as a liaison to the Israeli National Police, investigating suicide bombings and providing real-time intelligence back to New York to the NYPD as they ramped up their efforts to prevent terror. So we're not kind of going too far away from the police theme, because my next guest has certainly been a police reporter and a true crime queen, if you can call her that, for sure. She's written 8 books. She's been on television. She's definitely got her finger on the pulse in that genre. Of course, as I mentioned, she's tracked celebrities and cops alike through her work. She's no stranger to television. She was formerly on Fox News as a crime reporter, and she spent 6 seasons as host and executive producer of True Crime with Aphrodite Jones. And that, of course, is Aphrodite Jones, who joins me now on the Mike DeMayo podcast. First on Police Off the Cuff with me, Mark DeMayo, and now on my solo show, Aphrodite. Thank you for putting up with me yet again.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here.
It's good to have you. So, born in Chicago, but raised on Long Island. Interesting childhood. Take me through it.
Okay. Well, my childhood, my dad was a military career man. So I was born on the Great Lakes Naval Base, actually. And he was he was 50 when I was born. So he retired early. He had been in World War II, Korea, and moved back to New York, where my mother was from. My father ran the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and my mother worked there. So she was the pretty Greek girl that got the top dude. And there you have it. My name is real. My grandmother's name was Aphrodite. And my father's name was Ashton Blair Jones, which back then nobody liked the name Ashton. He went by Blair. And that's about it. I did get my writing ability, I would say, from more my mother than my father, but my father was the genius of the family. He created high forms of calculus at Harvard. As I said, he ran the Brooklyn Navy Yard, all of that. And so, but to get to the point of why Long Island and what my interest and connection to crime was, the son of Sam was running rampant on Long Island at the time that I was 16 years old. So I'm dating myself, but that's okay. The fact of the matter is, at 16 years old, what he was doing was going around and killing lovers in cars that were around the ages of 16 and 17. That was his target. That was his focus. So I was with my very first boyfriend, and what you did is hang out in cars and make out. And I can remember so specifically the day we were in Queens visiting his cousin, and we got in the car and he started trying to make out. I said, I can't be here. This is not cool. I mean, I don't know where this guy is running around. And we were really, really afraid of it. And actually, I think that was the only serial killer we've had in the tri-state area. Boy, did he scare the living daylights out of me and everybody else. And he liked dark-haired girls too. That was his other thing. So I fit the description perfectly. And, hence that was always in the back of my mind. The other thing that I should mention when talking about my parents, Mike, is that both of them died of heart attacks. I mean, it was separate times. It was a few years apart. But the fact of the matter remains that by the time I was 21 years old, and I had lost my mother at 17, my father died when I just turned 21 weeks before, not even weeks, a week. And so I have had a life of extreme sorrow and sadness because of it. And ultimately was able to turn that around into why I have such compassion and empathy for victims. Because even though I wasn't a crime victim, I was a victim of unusual circumstances, which led to overnight deaths. I mean, heart attacks, boom, no warning, no nothing. And when you lose your parents that way at such a young age, you can understand what crime victims are going through. You have lived through something like it yourself. And so I think that's kind of what's given me my raison d'etre and how I came to this calling.
Aphrodite Jones is our guest here on the Mike the New Haven podcast. And Son of Sam is interesting that you mentioned that, because I have a little project with somebody who worked that case coming up soon. I don't want to say who. I'll tell you who it is off the air. You might know the name when we're done. But I guess with circumstances like that early on in life, you could either be a victim or a victor. And when you lose people that suddenly, where you don't see it coming, the person wasn't sick, and boom, as you said, it's an overnight death. It rocks your world in a way that you could fall apart. But it's amazing to see, as we'll discuss throughout this interview, how you've managed not to, and how you've managed not only to build yourself back up after those two crushing losses, but build yourself up even better than whatever you were before. And so you enrolled cross country from Long Island out to California to go to UCLA. What was it about UCLA and California at the time that attracted you?
Well, I always thought I'd be a movie star. That was the goal. I wanted to be a TV star or a movie star. That was the goal. I wanted to be an actress. I studied acting actually with Lee Strasberg himself, who made Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Marilyn Monroe. I mean, dating again myself, but this was my life. And I got out to LA as a student, but I was also, kind of looking around and who could I do auditions with? And that continued for many years. It turned out that all I was getting was casting calls on casting couches. And I ultimately decided, you know what, I can write. And I think that's what I'm going to do, because I'm not going to sleep my way. When you're a writer, nobody can accuse you of having found somebody to help you out. You either have the talent or you don't. With acting, modeling and that kind of thing, you can get those, big accusations of, oh yeah, she slept over there. And I want nothing to do with that. I wanted to have my own career that I was genuine in. And so, yeah, I went out to LA to think I was going to be a star, but it didn't happen. I wound up back in New York. That's when my father died. And from there, I started writing. Even just before he died, I started writing. And what I was writing was a column chronicling cable television, because that was brand new at the time. All there was HBO and Showtime. HBO was known for boxing and whatnot. So I was at the beginning of the Cinemax. I was at the launch of the Playboy channel. I was at the launch of the Disney channel. I was at all those launches, the Weather channel, which at the time I'm like, who wants to watch a Weather channel all day? Like, how
You'd be
crazy are
surprised.
these people? But so I got myself involved very much back then in my 20s with doing celebrity interviews, and still around that world. It wasn't just cable television. It was the people on those shows. Everyone from Carol Burnett to Joan Rivers and back again. So I was in that world, and really that's the world I wanted to be in. The glitz, the glamour, the ice sculptures that are at those big parties, the Disney, the fireworks. And that didn't happen for me much longer. I wound up back in New York. I did a PhD here at NYU. They wouldn't give me the letters. They didn't stamp me out because they didn't like my dissertation. And I had moved to Kentucky at that time to teach, to support myself at a very small school in Appalachia. And just by coincidence, I was doing radio broadcasting at that point. Because again, my goal wasn't just to be an actress. My goal was to use the acting platform to make a difference in the world. It wasn't just I wanted to be, like Marilyn Monroe. No. I wanted to be like Jane Fonda. Not that I was thrilled with what she did in Vietnam. There's a lot of problems there, but I wanted to be an activist. I wanted to use that platform to be an activist. It was always in my plan. So suddenly now I found myself in Pikeville, Kentucky, in the end of the world, 2.5 hours from any airport. And a woman was killed by an FBI agent. And nobody was reporting it. And this was in 1989. I mean, there was CNN, all those networks were around. I was like, where is everybody? I think the only people that came was like hard copy, one show. And I wound up writing a proposal for that book and selling it immediately. And how I thought I could write a true crime at that time, when there was no transcripts, no trial. The FBI agent took a plea deal. So there was just a moment where he was in a plea deal in the court, in the federal court. There was nothing. There was nothing. There was nothing for me to pull from back then. But, sometimes being young and stupid and not knowing what you don't know, frankly, is exactly what you need to get it going on. And I wrote that book. I worked with that family of quote unquote hillbillies. And, they weren't. They're mountain people. She had slept with this FBI agent, and she was his informant and helping him track and trap bank robbers in the triangular area between West Virginia, and Kentucky. And she helped him and fell in love with him. He was sleeping with her, and she got pregnant. And when that happened, she threatened to go to the FBI, to his wife. She was going to call Geraldo, all of it. And, you know, that show was on the air at the time. And he killed her. He had been relocated to the Miami office. He was living in the Miami area. He rented a car, got her in the car, and was talking to her about, oh, you know, we'll work it out. And meanwhile, he wound up strangling her, and hid that body in those hills of Kentucky that nobody would ever find. He ultimately had to lead the FBI and police to the remains of Susan Daniel Smith. That was her name, and it became a movie based on my book. Called Betrayed by Love. Patricia Arquette played the woman who was killed. Steven Weber from Wings and many other things played the FBI agent. So that was my foray into the crime world. I did learn through that a couple of things. One was I went on the Today Show with Brian Gumbel. All right. I know, again, dating myself.
I know who that is.
I don't know if you remember who that is.
I do. Yeah,
okay.
I'm a news buff.
He was a big deal. He was the man.
Still is. He has a Real Sports on HBO.
Well, his brother was the sports guy, and once he left, Good Morning, what was it? Today Show. Yeah. He kind of just usurped his brother's world. I don't want to go there, but I feel like that was really wrong what he did to his brother. But be that as it may, I went on with Gumbel live. I brought the sister of the victim with me from Kentucky. And when we got to Manhattan, I was told by one of the assistants, there's going to be somebody else joining you on the show tomorrow morning. And it was late. We didn't get in until 11 o'clock at night. It was, again, 2.5 hours from an airport. It was a lot of driving and then no direct flights, Anyway, what had happened was in the next morning, live with Brian Gumbel, I'm bathed in fire because who comes on but the prosecutor via satellite. And now I'm sitting there with the sister. Her sister was just killed. Nobody had done anything about it. Justice had just been served. And because the FBI agent pleaded guilty and copped a manslaughter plea, wound up in prison for a short period of time, only 8 years. And this prosecutor comes on and says, he was the hero here, meaning the FBI agent. He was the hero here. He's the one that led the authorities to her remains. If not for him, we would never have known this was a crime. We would never have found those remains. We would never have found that body. And somebody else had written a book to that very point, claiming that, if above the suspicion, if this guy hadn't come forward because of his heavy heart, then, we would never have solved this crime. Well, I was furious on the Today Show. I mean, I look at that old footage. It's on VHS tapes, and I see it and I think of it because I know when I lived it, I was livid. Like, first of all, they bamboozled me, but second of all, here's the prosecutor from Pike County saying basically everything I was saying was wrong, everything the sister was saying was wrong. And then to top it all off, Brian Gumbel said to me, "I heard there's a movie based on your book," and I said, "Yeah." And so you're making money from that movie, right? I thought, yeah, and you're making money from selling soap while I'm on your show, right? Paying your salary. Like, yeah. Whoa. And so that was my foray. And the other thing that happened too is I went on the Maury Povich show, which back then wasn't the Baby Mama Maury. It was a real show. Okay.
I got stories about that.
You remember that?
Yeah.
Anyway, you don't because you're too young. But anyway, he had a substantial talk show at the time. And I went on again with the victim and other elements. And who else was on it but the other writer, as well as Mark Putnam is the name of the agent, satellited in. And I was put in the studio audience and the other author was on the stage. And now I was being totally dissed by this author, by the agent, by the whole situation as somebody who didn't know anything. I didn't know anything. I was a dope. All right. I was in my 20s. So I'd written my first book. And suddenly Putnam from On Satellite is telling the audience, including me, that he just leaned over and grabbed her. And he didn't realize that he even killed her. And I got up and I said, "You're telling me there was smashed windshield in that rental car?" He admitted to that in his interview with the FBI when they were following one of his own. "And you're telling me you just reached over and grabbed her? That's what caused her foot to go through the windshield? Because you weren't choking her? You weren't choking her to death?" Well, that was it. That was kind of my foray into television and true crime. And, from there, I wound up writing my second book, which is a New York Times bestseller. I said goodbye to the NYU people with their dissertation they didn't like. Bye-bye. And here I am.
I have to, a couple of things. The Maury, baby mama Maury is what I grew up with, because my grandmother, my late great grandmother, who's been gone now, it's going to be 11 years, hard to believe. She was the sweetest woman in the world, but she would sit there and what we Hispanics refer to as her little batita, her little dress, in the living room, and I would sit there with her. We would watch Maury together, and it was the baby mama Maury. And where the test results revealed you are the father. That's one of my fondest memories. You bringing that up, that and Jerry Springer. Why a 7-year-old was watching that, I don't know, but that's why grandmas are the best. So let's give a shout out to the live chat here, our friends watching tonight. Thank you always for your support. Alicia B, Michelina Sereno, always a very pretty name to see in the chat. Boxing MMA 365, the big UFC fight is this weekend, I believe, UFC 270. I know he'll be on top of that. Raquel Pranzo and Peter Pranzo, of course, the legendary NYPD lieutenant, former guest of the show. And what the people that are watching tonight want to know is that lovely bookcase or series of cases behind you. I believe those are the cases you were working on, right?
That is the new book that I'm writing.
Oh, and it's all one project.
Documentation for one book. Mm-hmm. And actually, that's not even all of it. I think there's more if you want to say
sure.
That side. Yeah, it goes on forever. I'm writing a book about Carl Carlson, who killed his son, but first killed his wife 30 years prior, the mother of that boy. And I've been on 2020 with that. There's been a lot of coverage. I did a piece on my own show with that. At the time when I did the piece for True Crime on ID, the guy had just pled guilty to killing his son and copped a manslaughter plea, copped a second-degree murder plea. And he pled guilty to it. I mean, it was unbelievable. His second wife is the one who tracked him, wore a wire with the police, and was able to get him to concede that he caused a truck to fall on his son. So I started working with the wife because she wanted to write a book. And, in my world of continuing with true crime, I'm constantly bombarded with people who want me to write a book, who have a story. And it's hard because most people, the story it doesn't have the legs, as we call it in the business, to really be a book. It can't just be an open and shut case. It can't be a case where you don't know if somebody killed your family member or if it was a suicide. Those are horrifying things, and I have to deal and grapple with those things, but I can't write a book about it. Right. So this particular thing, when I got involved with the second wife, Cindy Best is her name, and I started talking about how this story is. The first thing I asked was, whatever happened with the wife in California? Because I know killers. And he didn't just kill his son. That woman who died in that fire in 1991 in California, I know he killed her. Now, he rescued his 3 kids out of that fire. So it made him look like a hero. But the truth was, his goal was to kill that wife. And he did. She died in that fire. He left her in there. So it turned out, just at the point that I got involved with the second wife, the trial hadn't started yet. It was still underway. And the California authorities had him transferred to California from the prison he was serving time in New York. And when they extradited him, the trial took so long that by the time I got involved, I was there in time to be at that trial. And I commuted to a crazy town called San Andreas, California for a month and a half, was at the trial, did everything I needed to do, met everyone I needed to meet, and had the killer on the phone with me before, during, and after the whole trial. So it was totally bizarre. Talk about getting an insight into a killer's mind, who of course was claiming that he didn't do it. He was tricked into taking a plea deal about his son, and the only reason they're going after him about his wife of 30 years ago was because of what he did with his son, that he stupidly agreed to a plea deal. I mean, the craziness of a killer, the mind of a killer, honestly, Mike, is something, right now, that's what I'm working with. And there's so much material because there were other fires and there were other accidents and there were other deaths. There were other things that were going on all around this man, not murders, but deaths with animals. And just creepy, creepy stuff. And, how he was able to be a free man all that time. Part of that is too, that the family of the first wife, who believed that she was killed, okay, didn't go to the second wife and say, look, we think he's a murderer. No, they let the second wife get married, have a child with this guy, and all of that, raising his 3 children from the first wife, and that all culminated in the murder of Levi Carlson, his son, who had the family of the first wife told Cindy about this. Had there been any knowledge about this, or had the son come forward, not just the family, but also the son himself come forward, I think he was just afraid of him. They were all afraid of him. But they kind of have his blood on their hands too, because I mean, and nobody, there was no justice for Levi Carlson until 5 years later, when the second wife, Cindy Best, went after her husband because she realized the next person he was going to kill was her. Okay.
I want to acknowledge Angela Ang in the live chat as well. Of course, retired NYPD officer. She's here tonight, and she's in this case I'm battling. She's helping me beat the copyright allegations. And she describes it as pretty much just that. Yes, crime is just a series of unfortunate incidents, and that's what you could chalk that particular case up to, right? In a sense.
Well, you know, you say a series of unfortunate incidents, yes. But then you look more deeply, I do, into the mind of the killer. And for example, let's talk about Robert Durst for a second. He died yesterday. People are, you know, kind of talking. One lawyer, his lawyer was talking about, oh, we're going to overturn this conviction. First of all, in California, there's no overturning a conviction. When somebody dies, the conviction is vacated. That doesn't mean that he was innocent. That doesn't mean he was acquitted. What it does mean is that that jury decided that he was guilty of killing his best friend, Susan Berman, in 2000. He was guilty of killing his first wife, whose remains have never been found, right. Kathleen. Okay. And I'm pretty sure they believed that he killed the Morris Black, the man who he lived next door to and friends with in Texas.
And dismembered.
Yes. And just exactly. Mm-hmm. And you know what I can't believe, and this is how clever and bizarre killers can be, is that Robert Durst, first of all, was living in that apartment complex as a woman who was mute because he felt people could recognize his voice because he's such a nut, okay? And he actually convinced a Texas jury, took the stand himself, which is unheard of, okay? Took the stand to say, I don't know what happened. He came after me. I wound up shooting him. It was self-defense. And the reason that somebody on that jury kind of believed him, apparently, is that the head was never found. He chopped up that body, admitted to it right on the stand. He said he came back from having shot him in self-defense, didn't know what to do. He's already a high-profile guy. He didn't want to be found out as a woman who was posing as a woman, blah, blah, blah. And that basically he panicked because he was a known person. And so he knew that his friend had saws and whatever in the house. I mean, the story he told on that stand, Mike, was unbelievable. And yet, because there was no head ever discovered of Morris Black, they couldn't establish the manner of death. They couldn't establish where the bullet went in, how the bullet went in, if it went into his head. Of course, this guy's claiming that he shot him in self-defense. Nothing could be established. And that's one of the things I want to mention to people out there who, and I know law enforcement knows this, but I don't think the average person realizes that, you know, reasonable doubt is not beyond the shadow of a doubt. If somebody's testifying that they chopped a body up, okay, and put it in plastic, went out to a hardware store and got plastic garbage bags and put those garbage bags into, you know, Galveston or whatever water body there was there, hello, you know, believe it. You don't need to know. You don't need to have a video footage of him chopping the body up, okay? But, you know, clearly that jury, someone on that jury, convinced others that it was self-defense, that they can't say it wasn't self-defense, and hence they acquitted him. You know, I mean, what? How does this happen in our country? I mean, seriously. So, you know, just to talk about right now, you get into that mind of a killer. Remember, Robert Durst got caught. Why? because he did that show, The Jinx, on HBO. And he was so anxious to take credit, in not realizing to take credit for what he got away with. That's it. That's what he wanted. He wanted to kind of make it known that, yes, he was involved, and yes, he was there, and yes, he was here and there and wherever. That was his best friend. But ultimately, he got on that hot mic in the bathroom and said, of course I killed them. I killed them all. And it was that was used by John Lewin, who I know, the DA in Los Angeles that prosecuted that trial, to say, proof positive now. Here it is. Here's your proof. You want a proof? Came out of his mouth. But why juries right now feel they have to have that video footage, even though, yeah, we have a lot of camcorders and whatnot, and phones that take pictures, is unfair to the victim's family in these cases. I mean, you have to be able to look at testimony, not just from the killer, but from anyone involved, and take that for what it's worth. Not just disregard it because you don't have video footage of it or audio tape of it. And I think we've come to a point in our society where a lot of things are upside down. We look at certain, crimes and murders, sometimes there's a good outcome and a lot of times there's not, because people on these juries aren't sure what to do. And I think at this point too, they're afraid. The jurors are afraid.
It's understandable. I get it completely. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, because not the jury, but what you were getting at earlier inside the mindset of a killer. Because when I had Detective Janansky on yesterday, I asked him, okay, well, what's the mindset of a terrorist, particularly a suicide bomber, since that's what he investigated? Killers' motivations are different. Durst is different from a organized crime hitman. That hitman's doing it because, well, he wants the money. He doesn't really care about the victim. It's just business. But then with somebody like Durst and people like Joe Rifkin or Son of Sam, sometimes there's mental aspects at play. But they're all alike in that they have a depravity within them. And if you could expand on that, and I'll ask you point blank, at a killer's core, well, just that. What is at a killer's core? It has to be more than depravity.
So, yeah, there are numerous factors that go into the making of a killer. For example, I was at the BTK sentencing. I'll talk about that in particular. Mm-hmm. I tell you, when I left that courthouse, I covered that for Fox, and I really was crying like a child at the airport. Why? Because he stood there proud as could be, referring to himself in the third person and taking complete responsibility for these projects that he called his victims that he murdered and bound and tortured and then had twisted sex with corpses. I mean, somebody like that is made, first of all, they start out being deviants, all right? There's something obviously wrong with the way they perceive the world. But yet, many of these people are able to have that double life. They can compartmentalize. And so the one side, he's working as a dog catcher, he has a job with the city, he's involved with his church, he's a deacon in the church, whatever the case. I mean, he's got that family life and all of that. On the other side, he's prowling the streets of Wichita for 30 years. And when you talk about a boogeyman, he was the boogeyman. Okay. And somehow he takes solace in this. He thinks this is great because once he satisfied the urge of killing what he was going to kill, just one woman, now the urge becomes stronger and stronger. And what I find is killers can't help themselves. And this is why, if you look, for example, Durst, he got away with the thing in Texas. He got away with killing his wife, Kathleen. Now he went to his best friend, Susan Berman. It escalates for them. It becomes a game. It becomes a twisted game. And I don't know if partially it's because they can't get that out of their mind. I think so. This is what I think. When you kill somebody, it's not easy. I don't care how depraved you are. But once you've done it, now that runs in your mind. That tape is running in your mind all the time. You're living with some consciousness of guilt. Even if you're a psychopath, even if you're a serial killer, you are still playing that tape over and over in your mind. You can't just forget it. Okay? So it kind of it snowballs on itself for these people who become serial killers or killing more than one person. And it may not be for, there'll be a number of years between where nothing happened, like Durst, like BTK, like this guy, Carl Carlson. There's a number of years, nothing happened. But somehow or another, they get back to that depraved moment because, again, they got away with it once, and then it's twice, and then it's another time. So, it's circumstances as well as the depraved mind. And obviously there's something in the brain of killers, of murderers, of people who are willing to take another's life that is missing, isn't right. And there's been study about it, the anatomy of a murderer. I'm aware of those kinds of studies. And again, what they say is, yes, there's something in the brain that's not quite the same if you do a scan of the brain than normal people. But because we don't understand the brain, because we only use allegedly 5 or 6% of our brain, we don't really have a grasp or a full sense of what it is piece they're missing, how it is that they really have no sense of, forget about empathy, they have no sense of responsibility, they have no sense of humanity, they have no sense of the worth of human life. I mean, how that happens is as much a symptom of what their circumstances are and what they've gotten away with, as it is how their brain works and functions, malfunctions. And I don't know that we'll ever quite get in there.
One of the scariest killers I've ever read about was Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, as he was called, organized crime hitman. And I first found out about him because, I was doing some random late night Wikipediaing on one of my favorite wrestlers as a kid, Stone Cold Steve Austin. And Stone Cold Steve Austin talks about how he based his wrestling character kind of off of Kuklinski. And for those of you that don't know Kuklinski, like I said, mob hitman. And when he describes his victims, he really treated it almost like a business. He'd go in, it was almost a science to him. He'd execute them, usually with the firearm, always with the firearm. And he'd thaw them out for a few days, dump them in the river, and for years, nobody would know it was him because he had it down to a science to where forensically he was clean. Something like that, someone like that. Sometimes it's not even just the wanting the recognition. Sometimes it isn't even just thinking it's okay or having that urge and desire. After a while, it's almost like an athlete. You want to show even after you retired, you could still hit that shot. You could still score that goal. You just do it because you can.
Exactly. And it's a power trip and it's playing God. And that's, at the bottom of all this. And I will say who you're reminding me of is El Chapo, because I was at his trial. Okay. Oh yeah, I was there. And I have to tell you, that man and the hitmen and the other drug lords who testified against him from Chicago, from Colombia, from other parts of the world, okay, in Mexico as well. Those people who testified against him and described all the killings they did on his behalf. And the fact that there were rooms, this is so creepy. I saw the pictures of it. A room in the first floor, the basement floor of certain safe houses, that they completely covered with white plastic. So they were kill rooms. So that the person, whoever that they wanted to kill, would literally be killed in a place where everything could be cleaned up and washed up and just like washed down the drain. And it was all perfect. That's how sick they were. And they testified to it. But one of the most harrowing, I think, elements of the testimony throughout that trial was the time in which one person said that it was El Chapo who had someone killed himself because he didn't have other people to do his dirty work. And nobody wanted to, of course he killed people, but nobody wanted to come forward with that. And people were afraid, was this jury going to find him guilty? What was going to happen? But the one thing that I heard at the end of that trial was that El Chapo would take a branch from a tree and whip people who didn't please him for whatever bizarre reason, because he had a gold gun, he had a gold machine gun, he wanted to give his baby child a machine gun for birthday. I mean, he was completely wacko. But he actually ordered his people to throw the body of somebody he didn't like after he whipped him to near death, but the person was still breathing and conscious, throw him into a fire pit. and he's watching.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, so when you talk about people who don't care, it's not just that they don't care. Like you say, they get off on it somehow or another. There's the more they do, somehow the more they feel they can get away with it. And again, they love the idea that people fear them. They take such pleasure in playing God, and the fact that they have squelched a life, and the fact that people fear them. This is what the BTK is all about. He terrorized the Wichita area for 30 years. And all the while sitting back there posing as a deacon.
Right.
So there's, I mean, I don't know that we'll ever understand the minds really of these people. Truly. I mean, the more I get around it, the more I think, how can anyone operate that way? How do circumstances culminate for you to be able to just kill without thinking, like you're talking about your hitman? How does it happen?
That's a question that your guess is as good as mine. And then, as I discussed last night with Detective Jajansky about counterterrorism, think about terrorists. They're murderers too, even though the cause is different. With them, it's more political, it's more religious in some cases. But take Osama bin Laden as a crown example of this. After his attacks, even if he didn't do them directly himself, ordering people to do it for him, like El Chapo would, or like Pablo Escobar would. It's like, yeah, it was me. I did that. You see all that? That was me. Yeah,
absolutely.
And there's. Again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but how else could you call it but depravity? It doesn't matter what your cause is. It doesn't matter if it's for money. It doesn't matter if it's for simple pleasure. It doesn't matter if it's for a religious or a political goal, as terrorism is. There is something wrong with you to look at the suffering of another human being and say to yourself, yeah, I'm proud I did that. There are some questions in the live chat I don't want to miss from our viewers. And if you have any questions for Aphrodite, please submit them, and I'll be happy to showcase them for you so that she can answer them. And there's something that Angela Ang, retired NYPD officer, said here. She has two questions. The first one is this: is there a difference from the killers killing people and the ones doing? They know, I guess she's getting at here. She missed. She had a typo in this question. And the ones doing random killings.
So random killings, I find, are not random. In the life that I've lived following crime, okay, and murderers in particular, I don't find killers to do something randomly, okay? And what I mean by that is, forget, you have crimes of passion, okay? That's definitely not random, right? Mm-hmm. The person knows the killer, and that's the majority of murders, by the way. And then you have people like the BTK, like Ted Bundy, like, whomever you want to call, El Chapo, Guzman, who have a purpose there. And it isn't random. They truly choose particular victims. They are preying on a certain type of victim deliberately, okay, because it satisfies something in their mind. So while we think it's random, while we think, oh, it can't be connected, if you look at Son of Sam, he was going after young couples. If you look at BTK, he was going after what he thought were single women of a certain age. The fact that he killed someone's family was a mistake in the beginning. That wasn't in his plan. He was scoping out a single woman, and he didn't realize that he knew she had a child, but he didn't realize that the whole family was going to be home, or half the family was going to be home when he went after her. So whether she was single or somebody that he focused in on, he killed women that he felt were helpless, and he watched to make sure that he had the time slot where they were going to be alone and where he knew he'd have the time. He watched them for months, really. I went with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and looked at this stuff and sat there and saw where he would sit across the street from a house in a parking lot of a McDonald's or something, and just watch, making sure he knew every move of the victim. And again, in his case, he called them projects, which I find to be totally horrifying. But those projects were of a certain type, a certain brand, whatever that was that he was looking for. Okay. And so you talk about other serial killers that go after gay men, right? You think about, there's a case I covered in South Africa.
Cunanan.
Sorry?
Andrew Cunanan.
Cunanan, exactly. Perfect example. So, I mean, it's not random. That's one thing I have learned. It is not random. There's some kind of something in the person's mind that rationalizes this is the type of person I like to kill or want to kill, or I've gotten away with that, so I want to just get away with this because it's easy for me. So it's not random. It's really not random. Susan Berman was killed by Robert Durst the day before she was getting ready to testify or to give a deposition to police about what she knew of the disappearance of Kathleen Durst. Okay. That's not a mistake.
No.
That's not a coincidence. Okay. Now, the guy in Texas, poor person, somehow was later a victim of Robert Durst. And at that point, the person at Durst had gotten so depraved that now he was just looking to see what else he could get away with. So yeah, that can happen and be random. But again, that victim lived in the same building as Robert Durst lived in and was friendly with Robert Durst. It wasn't a stranger. So, that's my experience. I could be wrong, but from what I've experienced in 30 years of covering true crime and murder, it's not that random. It's not.
And the second leg of her question is this. Do you think, we talked earlier about playing God, which is what Durst did, and she references and does Angela Lang, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Jeffrey Epstein. Now, they didn't kill people, but they were abusers, obviously, and Epstein's dead, and Maxwell just got convicted. Do you think that they do it, she says, because they're wealthy and believe because of that wealth, because they have so much prestige, they can get away with anything?
Well, I was actually at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, believe it or not, in Manhattan. And what I want to say about that, I'm gonna reserve because I have a project that I'm working toward. But what I will say is this: as far as getting away with things because you have money, yes, absolutely. In that case, 1,000%. That's what that was all about, and that's why Prince Andrew is roped into it, and all these other people we see that somehow got roped into it because this guy had so much money, and so did his quote girlfriend and connections, that they felt they're above anybody else. No one, they're beyond reproach. Who's going to believe a 16-year-old girl versus a billionaire or a multimillionaire, and who's best friends with Trump and Bill Clinton, and rubbing shoulders with, not really best, but I mean, is right in the immediate orbit, has the most powerful people in the world. So yeah, for sure, in that case, no question. And Durst too. I think he felt he could get away with it because of his money, but he was more depraved. I don't think he cared about the money. Remember, he kind of ran away from the real estate empire. I would say it's less the case with the killer that there's going to be thinking they're getting away with it because of money. I think it's more the case with sexual victims that yes, the more power, the more money someone has. Yeah. I mean, that makes total sense. And it's true in the case of Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, no question.
As you noticed, listeners, we like to let our guests talk on this show. I'm glad that Aphrodite's here tonight because she's telling, we're just giving a lot of great observations into not only killer psyche, but also kind of the criminal justice system by extension, and how it goes about prosecuting these killers, either in the way it's supposed to or sometimes in the way that it's not, as we covered earlier in the case of the Kentucky situation involving that corrupted, both morally and ethically, FBI agents. So in that vein now, you've been around a lot of police departments, and we'll touch on some of these celebrity cases in a moment. And I asked you about this on Police Off the Cuff, but we can expand on it now for those that didn't hear that conversation. Police departments, big and small, resources in the billions, resources in the thousands in terms of money. It doesn't matter. At their core, there is an inquisitiveness and there is an excellence, some more than others because they deal with more cases of this nature with these investigators. So tracking these cases alongside these investigators who have dedicated their lives to these victims and, as they say, advocating for those that can't speak for themselves, what's amazed you most about them?
Well, the one case that haunts all of us, and I don't know how long we have to go, but I know I have about 10 more minutes. All right.
It's fine.
If that's okay. But the one case that haunts all of us is JonBenet Ramsey.
Yes.
And the reason it haunts all of us is because the police in Boulder, Colorado, at that time, in the mid-90s, did not have any murders that they had ever covered, did not have experience with homicides at all, did not know what they were doing because it was initially thought of as a ransom and a kidnapping, did not sweep the house properly to find JonBenet in the basement. The father, John Ramsey, found JonBenet in the basement. Now we've already got a murder victim that now is tainted. And on top of all of that, there was a fight going on between the district attorney and the police that they could never make it stick. They could never figure out how this happened or why it happened. And so while yes, everybody has the best of intentions, I will say that smaller police departments, okay, and I hate to say this, but who don't have the resources and who do not have the experience, even more importantly, will many times screw up something horribly.
Yeah.
And not on purpose, some of them on purpose, but in big police departments, we know the corruption in Chicago PD. I covered it. I did a story on somebody that they put away, Tyrone Hood. That was part of getting him set free. I was actually part of it because he was on my show. But the smaller police departments who don't have the experience and want to take the credit and march around, a crime scene that they don't know what they're doing, and they won't take help from the FBI. There are all these fights, these egos that are in between things that do get in the way of justice, and that, why we don't have a perfect justice system. It's not just bigotry. It's not just racism. It's not just, anti-women or, whatever you want to call it, people that are misogynist. It's a lot of things. But at the end of the day, Mike, I think what you're getting at, I know for me, the average cop, small department, large department, from the FBI, not from the FBI, are there to serve the community. They want to help people. They want to help victims. They want to solve crimes. And that's what they're there for. And what I find is so disheartening these days is that people have turned against the police. And, the media has turned against the police.
Oh, yeah.
And, that's who we have that distinguishes us from the other third world countries around the planet who have no police to intercede in China to say, oh, no, they didn't do that. Don't cut their head off. Don't make them be missing permanently. We have that here. And yet we are somehow eating ourselves up with that. We're destroying ourselves from within by pointing fingers at all police across the country because of a few bad apples or because of a few people who didn't know what they were doing.
Right. Because I'm about to say, a case like Ramsey, you give that to my friends in the NYPD when they were on. I've had a lot of homicide investigators on this show. They handle that case a lot differently. I mean, even for as much problems as the LAPD has, and they got a lot of problems, I think they know a thing or two about investigating a homicide because they've dealt with that. You go to big departments in Texas, but particularly I go to the NYPD examples because those are the people I interview the most. The way they handle homicides is incredible because a lot of the guys and gals I've spoken to were in the war zones of the city in the 80s and 90s when there was a lot of them. Now, I know you have to run. We'll get to the concluding segment in a second, but I do have one more question I don't want to ignore from Maui Swift here in the chat. And she says, do you think the Ramseys were involved? And it's interesting she brings that up before you answer because I watched an interview her brother did a few years ago. He gives me all sorts of bad vibes. He is a weirdo.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that of course I interviewed John Ramsey. I spent 2.5 hours with him. He didn't want to go on tape. He wanted to have this Christian book or some kind of self-help book that he wanted to promote later. So he wouldn't go on the show. But I will say this. It is my belief that someone in that house killed that child. Okay. It was not an intruder. I know that, there's an intruder theory. I know I know somebody who is absolutely in law enforcement and absolutely believes that 1,000%. I have gone through this scenario in every which way possible. And in my humble opinion, the killer was somebody in that house.
I believe it. I agree.
Okay. And I think it's interesting that the interview that Burke Williams did with Dr. Phil, that's the one you're referring to, which of course I watched, all of us watched. It was a 2-part interview. It was a long interview. Never has aired again. Okay. What does that tell you? And you can't find it on the web. What does that tell you? I'm not going to say, because I don't need to be sued for $200 million either. You know.
Actually, I just got a bulletin from my lawyer. The views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent. I'm kidding. You know. So yeah, I firmly believe, because something's off. It's one thing to be nervous. Sometimes when we're on camera, you know, I don't experience this because obviously I do a podcast. But sometimes when we're talking about subject matter that's difficult, you know, it's one thing to be nervous. And if he would have broke down crying, I would have understood it, because that's his sister. But he didn't. He just had this weird smile, and he was just talking like this. You know, I saw her, and I'm like, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist and a world-class investigator or detective to know something's up with this dude. And I guess we can kind of leave it at that, because I don't have $200 million in the bank, so I don't want to get sued either. Well, this has been a very fun conversation. The hour's really flown by, and we have a segment here. And don't say goodbye yet. We'll say goodbye off the air. We have a segment here that we always wrap up with rapid fire, 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 answers from you. Are you ready?
Yeah.
First, you kind of discussed it, but nonetheless, for the most notable interview you've ever done.
Most notable
interview that you've ever done of anybody.
Interview. Oh my God. I'm going to say O.J. Simpson.
That's pretty notable. And I got to say, he's on Twitter. I hate to give it to him. He's unintentionally, he's hilarious. He's actually pretty good on social media. I don't know how, but he's pretty good on Twitter.
It wasn't an actual interview, but I did have interactions with him at the Las Vegas trial in the hallways, because I happen to know somebody who played ball with him in the NFL. And I was able to get that guy on the phone. And so we started a whole exchange, and he was back and forth with me throughout that 2008 trial. And I knew he was going away. I knew what the DA had. So I would say for sure, O.J. Simpson. Now, what next?
A second, if you can report on anything else besides true crime, what would it be?
Yeah. So it's not my choice, just so you understand that. I didn't want to continue with true crime after I wrote my first book. I really wanted to go back to the glamour world, because that feels a lot nicer to me. It's a calling. And so if I could do anything else, cover anything else in this world, it would definitely be something to do with music, something to do, like I did write a book about Michael Jackson. To me, that's where the fun of life is. That's where the joie de vivre is. Music, Beyonce, Taylor Swift, whomever, people that bring smile to our faces, that bring happiness to our souls. That's where I'd want to be.
Third thing you miss most about your television show, which ran for 6 seasons.
Things that I
miss most about your television show, yes.
Oh, let's see. I mean, I'm not sure I heard you because your voice is low, but I mentioned most.
Things that you miss most about your television show.
Most. Oh, okay. So, oh my God. I miss having a crew and having a whole team of producers to enable me to get to these interviews that otherwise, while you're on your own, when you're on your own in a book, you're on your own. Okay. I miss that camaraderie of that, because again, when I'm writing, which I have been doing now for 1.5 years, writing is the loneliest profession in the world. And you're isolated, you're in a box, and really there's nobody there with you. So I'd say that's what I miss the most, is having that backup, having people be able to get interviews that are so hard for me to pull out of a hat alone, and having that camaraderie, having people that care about each other, and having my makeup artists and being able to make jokes about weird things that we found in interviews with the producers, with the whomever was in the room, with the sound guy, with the grips, because you hear things in interviews, as you know, that you really can't even believe.
Right.
And doesn't make the air. But,
no, of course.
Inside baseball, you're all like busting at the seams. Like you can't believe you're keeping a straight face when somebody told me that Michael Peterson's wife was killed by an owl, which of course is a big theory out there. I wrote the book on it. I did an episode on it. I interviewed Peterson in prison. It's that thing, The Staircase, now on Netflix. But I had to interview the guy who came up with that theory and sit there with a straight face. And he's telling me that an owl killed Kathleen Peterson. I mean, stuff like that, Mike, is priceless. I can't even.
No, of course. And to your point earlier about my voice, my mom says the same thing. Your voice is so low. You have to talk louder than that. You have a deep voice. And there you go. So she's going to love that part of the show. Fourth, best advice anyone ever gave you.
Best advice anyone ever gave me is work for yourself.
That's good advice. That's good advice.
It was great advice. I was so sad at the time. I was in my 20s and I was a freelancer. And this man was a huge architect. And I was interviewing him for cable stuff. And I said, but I'm a freelancer and, I don't have a real job. And he said, that's the best thing you could do is work for yourself. And boy, he was right.
Fifth and finally, knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would you tell a young Aphrodite Jones?
I would say it's okay to not know exactly what you're doing. And it's okay to just get started. Don't wait until you feel you're ready. If you want to do it, that is your talent. Go do it. Bite the apple. That'll make it happen.
There you go. That concludes what's been a great episode of the Mike to New Haven podcast. Aphrodite, you were amazing. Of course, like I said, stick around. We'll say our goodbyes off the air. I know you're working on a book right now. Is there any other projects you want to give a shout out to or anyone you want to give a shout out to?
Really. I just want to say I was at Ghislaine Maxwell's trial and boy, I don't know what's going to suss out there. They're trying to make those jurors now. They're trying to overturn it with the jurors that were sexually abused. It's a story that I'm following closely.
All right. Well, there you go. One last shout out to the live chat, of course, and I'll let you know what's coming up next on the show. Peter Pranzo, Raquel Pranzo, Angela Ang, Box MMA 365, Michelina Serino, Alicia B. And of course, I'm going through here. Forgive me if I miss anybody. I'll try to get to you as soon as I can. And Maui Swift. Thank you guys very much for your support. Always appreciate you guys supporting the show. Coming up next on the Mike to New Haven podcast, Monday, January 13th, 1997. 5 letter bombs at the United Nations. And I'll be speaking with the men who defused them. For volume 18 of Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's bomb squad, Detective Jeff Oberdier, Paul Yerkoop, Rich Teamsma will return to the show to discuss that case and what it means 25 years later in the ongoing war on terrorism. In the meantime, on behalf of Aphrodite Jones, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, and I'll see you Friday.